In early 1969, John McLaughlin, the British jazz guitarist who had been working previously in the scene in London, doing various sessions, arrived in America on the invitation of the drummer Tony Williams. Tony Williams previously had been the drummer with Miles Davis, emerging in the mid-60s at a very young age and being the propulsive talent behind the classic quintet of the 1960s that featured also Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter and Ron Carter. By 1969, culturally, the world was changing. Tony Williams, being a young musician, wanted to be part of the counterculture. He wasn't interested in playing jazz with Miles Davis anymore. He wanted to join the revolution and create something that could tear down society. And with this in mind, he decided to put together a group that would become the Tony Williams Lifetime. The Tony Williams Lifetime would feature Larry Young on organ. Larry Young had already made a name for himself as the futuristic organist who had taken what the likes of Jimmy Smith and Jack McDuff had done, combining it with the music of John Coltrane and modal jazz, and pushed the Hammond organ into the future. Tony Williams wanted to create an electric outfit. He wanted to have the daring of jazz, but the immediacy of rock, and that meant high volume. And so he decided to pull together Larry Young on organ and John McLaughlin on guitar, in what many think was the first fusion band. As soon as John McLaughlin arrived in London, within hours he had met up with Miles Davis, who invited him to a recording session the following day. Miles had always been a genius at being able to spot young talent and utilise it to push his vision forward. And so John McLaughlin found himself in a recording studio with his hero, Miles Davis. The subsequent sessions became the landmark album In a Silent Way, which sees a change in Miles's music as he leaves jazz behind and also explores the outer limits of the fusion between jazz and rock music. John McLaughlin would not become a member of Miles's band, but he would contribute to a number of albums, including Bitches Brew, Jack Johnson, and Live Evil. On Jack Johnson, he was paired against Billy Cobham, and on that album, we see the beginnings of serious jazz rock emerging at the same time that John, with Tony and Larry Young, was exploring the outer limits of rock and jazz in Tony Williams' lifetime. Tony Williams' lifetime was badly managed and badly recorded. Their debut album was a double album called Emergency. This album was groundbreaking, but sounded absolutely awful. The label that they were on was unable really to support them in terms of the vision that they had. By the second album, they had brought in from Cream Jack Bruce. This was now still a lineup, and the production was a lot better on the second album, which was called Turn It Over, a reference to turning over society, the revolutionary ideas of Tony Williams embodied in this group. But the inclusion of Jack Bruce still did not make this band a success. And somewhere around about 1971, the Tony Williams Lifetime ran out of steam. It may have changed music forever, but it hadn't connected with the public. John McLaughlin had turned up to some live concerts at the Cellar Door with the Miles Davis group. These would eventually turn up on the album Live Evil. And backstage on one of these concerts, Miles had turned around to John McLaughlin and said, "You should form your own band." When Miles tells you to do something, you do it. And John McLaughlin decided to do that and pull together a special new band to explore some of the ideas that he had been exploring with the Tony Williams Lifetime. The first obvious choice was Billy Cobham, who had played so brilliantly with him on the Jack Johnson album. And they decamped to John's flat, where they would play some of the early versions of the Mahavishnu Orchestra tunes, just drums and guitar. On bass, he brought in his old mate from the UK, Rick Laird. Rick Laird was an Irish bass player who had moved as a child to New Zealand and then come back to London in the early 60s, where he'd been the house bass player at Ronnie Scott's. Rick Laird could play anything. He could sit in with the likes of Sonny Rollins, he could play rock jazz, but he was not an extrovert player. Rick Laird would provide the grounding for this band. On keyboards, he pulled in Jan Hammer. Jan Hammer was a Czech virtuoso pianist who had arrived in New York in the late 60s and pretty quickly got the gig with Sarah Vaughan. Miroslav Vitous, another Czech musician, was forming the band Weather Report and asked John if he wanted to join that band. When John said he was forming his own band, he needed a keyboard player, he suggested Jan Hammer. And when John McLaughlin found out Jan Hammer was playing keyboards with Sarah Vaughan, he knew this guy was good, and Jan was appointed the keyboard player. John McLaughlin from a young child had been enamoured with the violin, and he wanted a violin player in this band. But he didn't want a jazz violinist, he wanted a rock violinist. At that point, there was only really one guy on the planet he could choose, and that was Jerry Goodman, who was playing in the band The Flock. Jerry Goodman was not only a violinist influenced by Jimi Hendrix, but he was also a classically trained violinist. He would know how to play these insane compositions that John McLaughlin had in mind that would push rhythm, speed, time signature playing to the max. Once the band was put together, he found himself very quickly in the studio, signed to Columbia Records, negotiated by Miles Davis's management. This time he had a proper record deal, he had some backing, but even with that, he was only afforded 2 days in the recording studio. When the band set up and started playing, they were so loud that the engineer walked out. And eventually, this recording was salvaged by the next engineer that came on. The album was pretty much recorded live on the spot. When we listen to the Inner Mountain Flame, it is an absolutely incredible album, and it has come along to herald the new, which it does incredibly. It's a groundbreaking album. The fact that this band had only just formed and had to learn these incredibly dense compositions by John McLaughlin and then go into the studio and one day record this live is absolutely jaw-dropping. This band had ideas for music that had never been heard before, but these ideas were at the service of a vision that John McLaughlin had that went beyond music. John McLaughlin had signed up with the guru Sri Chinmoy and was exploring all sorts of spiritual ideas, and he wanted to change the world through music. This was the idea of the Mahavishnu Orchestra. The word Mahavishnu Orchestra had been given to him by Sri Chinmoy. It was with this that John McLaughlin went into the studio. Now on paper, this should not have been a success. What we had is the loudest, fastest band in the world playing instrumental music that pushed at the extremes of what the listener could take. But it seemed to chime with the times. The post-hippie generation that were listening to music in the early 70s, they wanted their mind blown. And pretty soon the Mahavishnu Orchestra became the band that would blow your mind. And they became a very successful concert draw. And their management pushed this, so they ended up doing lots and lots and lots of concerts, touring continually. Taking some time off to get in the studio again, they recorded their second album, Birds of Fire. Birds of Fire was an advance on what the Inner Mountain Flame had been. With more time to record, with a better engineering from the great Ken Scott, who'd worked with the Beatles, this album sounded absolutely stunning and saw the bringing together of a number of elements that made the Mahavishnu Orchestra special. Firstly, we had the melodies of the violin and guitar combined, both bending notes and exploring the microtonic possibilities of melodies that were highly influenced from Indian music. The band was playing in odd times, but they were playing in at odd times in a completely new way, as Billy Cobham pioneered an approach to rhythm which could be called additive, which started from the inside and worked out, building time signatures up from small groups of twos and threes rather than carving the time up with crotchets. Jan Hammer, on the first album, had pushed the electric piano to the limits, using devices to bend the notes. By the time he got to Birds of Fire, the Moog synthesizer had been given to him, which allowed him to bend the notes microtonically, and taking his lead from Indian music, he started to do this. This is absolutely groundbreaking. These elements that I've described really become the building blocks for jazz rock fusion and are emulated by everybody else who wants to plug in and try and sell some records. And sell some records they did. Birds of Fire was an even bigger seller than In a Mountain Flame, and established them as one of the bands to see on the scene in the early 70s. This band had sold so many records and sold so many tickets that they were perceived in a completely different way to a lot of the other jazz groups on the scene at the time. The Mahavishnu Orchestra almost single-handedly created the jazz rock genre in terms of commercial appeal. The record companies now were interested in signing bands like this because they could sell records. And suddenly we saw all the other Miles Davis alumni doing the same thing. And very soon we've got Return Forever, The 11th House by Larry Coryell, Weather Report, and then later Herbie Hancock's Headhunters, as the record companies try and cash in on this new jazz rock phenomenon. But the Mahavishnu Orchestra themselves are being pushed to the limits. Endless touring, endless concerts, and then punctuated by trying to record new ideas and new material, starting to put stress on the band. They went into Trident recording studios in London in 1973 to record their third album. John McLaughlin had the idea of combining the sound of the Mahavishnu Orchestra with the sound of a real orchestra. He wanted to move towards the much more panoramic, expansive version of the band. But in creating the Mahavishnu Orchestra, he had adopted an approach to music making and music composition that came straight out of the jazz world. Jazz artists do not sell lots of records, and they have to recoup the costs as much as they possibly can. And so if John McLaughlin came into a Miles Davis session and contributed some compositions to it, it would most likely be that Miles Davis would still take compositional credit for those. That's what you expected to happen. But with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, things were different. The band was full of incredible musicians with incredible vision, and they wanted to write. They could have well been contributing ideas to the band compositionally that were then being taken on as being John McLaughlin's compositions. When you're selling 10,000 albums, it doesn't mean so much. But when you're making albums that are getting into the top 20 in the US, there are royalties and the prestige there for the taking. And this starts to create a schism within the band. By the time they get to the recording sessions for their third album, Jan Hammer, Rick Laird, Jerry Goodman are all wanting to put in their own input. Not so much Billy Cobham. Billy Cobham made the wise decision to go elsewhere to express himself, and in 1973 he had recorded the album Spectrum with Tommy Bolin on guitar, which went on to become one of the most important albums in the history of jazz rock fusion. But the other guys wanted their compositions played. These sessions saw the recording of compositions by Jan Hammer in The Great Sister Andrea and by Rick Laird. But these sessions did not go well. It was reported that John McLaughlin ended up shedding tears at the end of many of these sessions, and eventually the musicians walked out and the album was not completed, to be released many years later in 1999 as the Lost Trident Sessions. Instead, they decided to call it a day and record a live album at Central Park in New York. This became their third and final album, Between Nothingness in Eternity, which features 3 tracks: Trilogy, Sister Andrea, that was written by Jan Hammer, and the side Long Sweet Dream. And with that, the Mahavishnu Orchestra was done. In a short 2 years, they had completely changed music history and the idea of what a rock band was capable of. The Mahavishnu Orchestra was one of the few bands to take the ideas of Jimi Hendrix and move them further forward, and can almost be seen as taking the ideas of the 1960s in terms of self-expression and moving those forward. And yet suddenly, in 1973, it was all over. The bass player Rick Laird recorded one solo album called Soft Focus, but his interest in photography took over from his interest in taking sessions for artists and albums, which were in the end nowhere near as creative as what he'd done with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and he slowly moved out of the business. Jerry Goodman and Jan Hammer worked together on an album called Like Children. Jerry Goodman seemed to flirt with making music off and on. Jan Hammer went on to form one of the greatest jazz rock fusion bands of all time, the Jan Hammer Group, but never got the commercial success that he had had with the Mahavishnu Orchestra. And this went on for a long time until he actually got asked to make the music for the TV show Miami Vice, which then pushed him into a position commercially which was even greater than anything the Mahavishnu Orchestra had ever done. John McLaughlin still wanted to put his ideas into the Mahavishnu Orchestra. A new band was pulled together, this time with many alumni from Sri Chinmoy's religious group, with the hope that there would be more internal harmony in the band. And what was interesting with the Mahavishnu Orchestra is this band also contained male and female people in the band, quite a rarity at that time. This band was a lot larger, and the first album was the realisation of the orchestral ideas that John McLaughlin had been having. Apocalypse, which is the fourth Mahavishnu Orchestra album, is a monumental album. Produced by the great George Martin, it utilises the London Symphony Orchestra as well as the expanded Mahavishnu Orchestra. The expanded Mahavishnu Orchestra featured the great Narada Michael Walden on drums, Ralph Armstrong on bass, Gail Moran on keyboards, and Jean-Luc Ponty on violin, plus a brass section and a string section. This group went into the recording studio and recorded Apocalypse under the production skills of George Martin and under the music conducting skills of Michael Tilson Thomas. This was an epic album, with the band recording at exactly the same time live as the orchestra, which required new techniques of recording, in that Narada Michael Walden's incredibly loud drums had to be placed in a different part of the building, and he had to be connected to the conductor via closed circuit television, something that was a very rare thing at the time back then. The Apocalypse album features some of the Mahavishnu Orchestra's greatest music, and on this album we see John McLaughlin really stretching out on the solos, but it didn't seem to quite capture the imagination as the first Mahavishnu Orchestra had done. This could well be to do with the charisma that the first band had. The first band seemed to be a band of superstars, but with this band, albeit with the likes of Jean-Luc Ponty, Narada Michael Walden and Ralph Armstrong, the band also featured many people just sat there playing violin or trumpet in the background who were a little bit faceless. Also, the surprise had already happened, and the expectation for this album must have been so great in 1974. As time has gone on, many people now see this album as being truly great. The second album, recorded by the second version of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, was Visions of the Emerald Beyond. This featured this time just the expanded Mahavishnu Orchestra under the engineering skills of Ken Scott. In many ways, this album sounds more orchestral than Apocalypse, but the vast panoramic orchestral aspect of this band is portrayed through the production. There's many people out there that think this is the greatest Mahavishnu Orchestra album of all time, and I am one of those people. In fact, I think this is the greatest album of all time. It is an unbelievably complex album, which takes the sound of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, expands it out, but also pushes it to a funkier direction. This album is all over the place. It sounds absolutely incredible. Narada Michael Walden's drumming on here is some of the greatest drumming ever. And I say all this because at the time, this album was not received as well as the early Mahavishnu Orchestra albums. In fact, people thought that John McLaughlin had lost his way a little bit. And perhaps John had. Perhaps at this point in time, John was moving on. Perhaps the idea of changing the world through music, perhaps this had been achieved. And his mind started to turn to other things. He wanted to go more towards Indian classical music and create a much more homogeneous fusion between that using acoustic instruments. This ended up being the band Shakti. But he still needs to produce another album before he could get out of the contract with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and this album was Inner Worlds. Inner Worlds is perhaps the least successful of these 6 albums created by the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Recorded out in France, in the same chateau that Elton John had recorded Honky Tonk Chateau. Now the band had huge budgets and a lot of time to record the album. It's a good album, but it feels much more of a group effort with Narada Michael Walden and Ralph Armstrong and Stu Goldberg now on keyboards contributing a lot of ideas. John McLaughlin is there and contributes some great solos, but the compositional approach of the Mahavishnu Orchestra is lacking. It does not sound like a Mahavishnu Orchestra album. John then formed Shakti and not only said goodbye to the Mahavishnu Orchestra, but also said goodbye to electric guitar playing for a while. The Mahavishnu Orchestra had existed from 1971 to 1976. It was a 5-year period that had seen really 3 incarnations of the Mahavishnu Orchestra. The classic lineup, which recorded the first 3 albums, which will be Billy Cobham, Jan Hammer, Jerry Goodman, and Rick Laird. And then the expanded lineup with Narada Michael Walden on drums and Jean-Luc Ponty that had recorded Apocalypse and Visions of the Emerald Beyond. And then this small group, which was Ralph Armstrong, Narada Michael Walden, John McLaughlin, and Stu Goldberg, that had recorded the last album, Inner Worlds. Now, this band is a very interesting band. And going back to some of the live performances that have been bootlegged, it was quite an incredible band. And I think it was underrepresented. This is also true of the One Truth band that John McLaughlin formed when he returned to electric guitar playing at the end of the 70s, which featured Tony Smith on drums, Fernando Saunders on bass, and Al Shanker on violin. The album that came out of those sessions, which was called Electric Dreams, is a great album, but listen to this as a live act. It was equal to the Mahavishnu Orchestra. And so when we look back at the Mahavishnu Orchestra, we have to see that what is important is to put it into the context of the time. Because by 1976, the record companies had moved on and they were no longer interested in pushing their budgets into bands that played instrumental, difficult music with long solos and lots of on-time signatures. The world had changed. Many artists that had come up in the jazz rock revolution of the early 70s moved towards making commercial music. Narada Michael Walden was one of those musicians that managed to do that successfully with his own solo career, making some incredible disco music in the late 70s and then going on to produce the likes of Aretha Franklin, Mariah Carey and Whitney Houston. But for many jazz rock musicians, they just could not make that jump. They weren't able to do this. And so the span of the Mahavishnu Orchestra from 1971 to 1976 actually, in a way, is the span of the jazz rock era itself. Simply 5 years. 5 years when the record industry were interested in putting their money into bands that were pushing the envelope creatively and pushing music out there. By the end of the 70s, the music press was no longer interested in stuff that was musically interesting. It was far more interested in pushing stuff that was culturally interesting. And the relevance of these bands seemed to be lost in a music industry that was far more interested now in punk and new wave. But looking back 50 years later, we can see how incredible the Mahavishnu Orchestra was. On this video, I wanted to create a short and sweet explanation of who the Mahavishnu Orchestra were and provide a little history for those who have just come to this band for the first time. On my YouTube channel, you will find tons and tons of video that explores John McLaughlin and the Mahavishnu Orchestra in detail. But I hope you liked this video. If you did, please put a like on the video and subscribe. And if you want to support me in what I'm doing, you can become a patron, or you can put a donation into my PayPal tip jar. The links are down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.
It's my view that this unbelievable happening between these 5 musicians came as much as for its time as it was perfect for in its time. I think there was a real space for it at the time to blossom in the way that it did. I mean, I think with the passing of Jimi Hendrix, maybe there was a big opening for John in terms of the very, very big guitar presence that Jimi Hendrix had left. What really impressed me, or really became evident to me, was the fact that maybe there was a leaf taken out of Miles Davis's philosophy, where he made the statement that the best bands are mixed bands, and in this way, I really see that as being what the Mahavishnu Orchestra really represented in terms of its members. And if you look at who they were, of course, led and being the brainchild of the ever mercurial John McLaughlin, this was something that really could have only existed in from what he came from, which was these records I got to know well before Mahavishnu of John in the 60s, with people like Sandy Brown and his Gentlemen on an album called Hair at Its Hairiest, and a lot of these kind of session type of albums that John played on from way back. And it was quite evident to me that at that point he was a real jagged edge in the area of jazz guitar, from where he was coming from, this modernist, but with this, taking this overdrive sound and really coming from a lot of different scopes. His background in rhythm and blues and of course jazz and the things he was mainly fond of, things, areas such as flamenco, of course, the blues was in Mahavishnu's music, Indian music, of course, North and South Indian music, folk even, in a way, by way of Jerry Goodman, this kind of beatnik looking Chicago violinist. The Panamanian drummer, of course, Billy Cobham, who rose to prominence also with Miles Davis. Rick Laird from Ireland, who to me really served the band perfectly. Right, in spite of the gregarious players, heavier presence players, at that time that were coming in, I felt Rick provided just the perfect grounding for everything. And maybe that's a good word, grounding, because he was very grounded in what he did, and he, out of his years with the Buddy Rich band, he knew exactly how to really apply himself and come to grips with playing with somebody like Billy. And then you had Jerry Goodman, who I know that John definitely didn't want a jazz violinist. He wanted a rock violinist, and one steeped in maybe Chicago blues, or maybe the definitely classical. I mean, I think his parents were classical, or at least one of his parents was a classical violinist. So he had that, which brought to me a kind of heavy classical presence in the music. Um, and of course, Jan Hammer. What can we say about him? He was this, as I often refer to him, this former Czechoslovakia meets New York. So there he is with all this fantastic rhythm and propulsion in his playing, and with all of this Eastern European discipline in his playing from his formative years, and particularly his harmony, which was very impactful on me and very influential on me. And of course, John found him playing with Sarah Vaughan at whatever period around the formation time of Mahavishnu. And it was just the perfect bunch of musicians. I mean, they were fantastic together. I just cannot think of any more seminal, influential band who came and shocked the world into submission with sheer intent and volume and emotion, and in terms of what they expressed, which was pretty much, of course, integrating the jazz. You know, if you look at the fact they were trading choruses stuff. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that like derived from the old Dixieland band, where they're all trading choruses and stuff. There was such a large sort of improvisational scope for the musicians in by way of the writing. It wasn't overwritten, but it was enough to be insanely intriguing, and it was coming from so many different influences and areas by way of what all those musicians had become versed with and what they were all involved with in the front line in pushing forward at that point. And I think this is probably only some of what that made that band so great. You had the time and place element of the way recording sounded in those days. Funny enough, maybe the Inner Mounting Flame was sort of a harder lesson on me than things, you know, the perfect realization, which is evident on Birds of Fire, the second studio album. And I loved all the periods of the band, particularly the very, very early, and particularly later on into sort of later 1973, when they really started coming together big time with the impossible heights they were achieving musically with one another. It was really more than formidable. It was earth-shatteringly fantastic and exhilarating, and amazingly eventful for many of his musicians coming up at that time, like me included, who happened to think that Mahavishnu was just like, commonplace electric music of the time. I couldn't have been further wrong. We were witnessing something extremely amazing at that point, even though I was too young to see them live. Through all the many bootlegs and the forever impacting albums, this was just music from another universe and galaxy. So very happy to talk about Mahavishnu with you, and have a great online show.